The guy on the far end looks down at his watch and he says to the three of us, "It's September 11th.
Oh my God, there it goes!
I had been visiting my former girlfriend, Kelly, at her, I had stayed about a week or so at her apartment in Jersey City, right across the Hudson from Manhattan. And I was actually planning on leaving to come home that morning, come back to York that morning. Kelly had just moved in to her apartment in July, so she didn't have telephone service hooked up. That was scheduled for the very next day. She walked a couple of blocks from her apartment to the PATH train station, took the commuter train into Manhattan, and her final stop was in the basement of the World Trade Center building, where she would get out each day and then walk the 2 blocks over to her office on Wall Street.
I had just dropped my son off at Lincoln Way Elementary School. That Tuesday was the student day at the York Fair, and it's been a tradition with our family to take the day off from school and work to go to the York Fair. The school allows the students to be out, and I had just stopped at the firehouse, which is next to the school, and I just sat down in the office and the phone rang. It was our department chief, and he said, "Doug, are you watching the news?" And I said, "No, I was not." And he said, "You need to turn it on. A plane just hit the World Trade Center."
I'll never forget our executive director was out of town, and when this happened, I mean, practically everybody stopped working and watched it. We went down the hallway to a room where they had TV, and we were watching the TV thing, and so it just seemed like no one there wanted to make a decision on what they wanted to do. Well, finally, around noontime, then they got around to making the decision for us to go on home.
I was planning on coming home that day, but as I had packed up the car, packed up all of my things, and I couldn't find my car keys. And this put me into a little bit of a panic. You know how frustrating something as simple as that can be. I'm tearing the house apart looking for them. Finally, I wondered to myself if Kelly hadn't accidentally picked up my keys and threw them in her purse or something and took them to work with her. So since she had no phone service at the house yet, I knew that there was a payphone at a small park about 2 blocks from, a block and a half or so from her apartment. I walked up to the park to call her at her office to see if she did in fact have my keys. And I'm standing at an intersection waiting for the traffic light to change. And I was just, very sort of frustrated and kind of kicking myself a little bit for losing something as simple as keys. Looking down at the ground when I heard the whine of a jet engine, or several jet engines. And I remember thinking to myself, that plane is flying way low and it's way off course, because the Newark airport was a couple miles in one direction, LaGuardia and JFK on the other side of Manhattan, of course, and I just knew that something wasn't right. And I remember thinking it's really weird that there's thunder on a beautiful fall day without a cloud in the sky, just a picture perfect kind of day.
I immediately went out to the watchroom and turned the TV on, and obviously it was live as to what was unfolding, and it had just happened because it was around 7:15 that I arrived at the firehouse.
And then I heard the rumble of the second plane hitting the South Tower.
You didn't know what all was happening. It's 3 Mile Island, which is very close to the Turnpike Commission. And so they finally came to the decision, but it took them till like noontime to make the decision to close the building down.
The light turns green, I cross the street, and all I would have had to do was glance to my left, and I would have been able to see straight down that street. It's everything in Jersey City, New Jersey, looks like it ends at the World Trade Center. Of course, the Hudson's in between there or whatever, but the towers were just so much larger than even any of the other buildings in Manhattan. But I didn't even glance to my left. Walked across the street, called Kel's office. She wasn't there. I hang up the phone and I turn around, and there's a guy standing in the middle of the street looking down towards the World Trade Center, and a woman in a jogging suit with a Walkman on comes running across the street yelling, "Two planes just hit the Twin Towers, two planes just hit the Twin Towers." And so at that point I turned and looked. I'm facing the opposite direction from where I just came. I turned and looked and could see both towers burning. And there's this sort of sense of disbelief in what you're witnessing. And so I said to the woman, I said, "Is that what we're looking at?" You know, obviously it was, but is that what we're looking at?
I didn't know, just like everyone else in the United States, something that obviously in my lifetime I had never experienced, and it was a loss for words. I was the only one in the fire station, so when you're alone and something tragic happens, the thoughts just roll as to what's going on.
Well, once the second plane hit, you knew it wasn't no accident. You know, it's a sad day in our country's history, I guarantee you.
And so we stood there for a couple of minutes, and she's listening to a news report on the radio, and she's telling me and this other guy who had been standing in the street when the plane, when I hung up the phone and turned around, and so I remember thanking her, and then just then the first of what were dozens and dozens of police cars and ambulances went screaming through that intersection, heading down towards the waterfront area of Jersey City. They had actually gone over to Liberty State Park and had set up a triage center there with I don't know how many first responders were on the Jersey side. They're preparing for the injuries that never came. Of course, there were very few injuries that day. It was all fatality.
On Wednesday morning, the job that I had at the time, I was a service technician for a local propane company, and I was doing a job in the Strownstown area. And as often is when you're by yourself working on a project, your mind tends to wander, and of course mine was on the events of the day before and what was still unfolding that Wednesday. And I thought, we have to do something. Our fire department has to do something. We're a very active department in our county and our community.
And then, of course, the next day, September the 12th, we were back to work.
I didn't have my camera with me at that time, but having been a photojournalist or a photographer for most of my life in one form or another, after listening to this woman give these updates over her Walkman for just a couple of, like I said, 2-3 minutes, I kind of snapped into photojournalist mode, and I ran back to Kel's place, and I got the only camera I had packed with me then, which was just a little point and shoot digital camera.
I picked up the phone and I called our department chief, and I told him that we needed to do something, and that was the inception of our collection at Carlisle Road and White Street. And that actually started that evening. It was that much of an immediate response.
We made it on the Bucket Brigade. Would have been late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning. That was before they weren't even letting the press close at that time.
Not knowing where Kel was, I put a note on the door that said, "If you get here before I do, stay put, I'm out looking for you." I taped that to the door, and I headed towards the waterfront area with the camera and this sort of crazy idea of trying to find her getting off the boats. They had closed the bridges and the tunnels going into Manhattan, and the only way people could get off the island they pressed into service all of the ferry boats, and they were bringing people over to the various docks. But there's, I don't know how many docks, dozens of docks, in Bayonne and Jersey City and Hoboken, the whole way up the western shore, the Jersey side of the Hudson. And so I went up there looking for Kelly, hoping to see her get off one of these boats in the hours that had passed. And that's where I spent most of my day.
First reaction was, geez, I wish I could be there to see it on TV and actually be there. No comparison. And luckily, a week to the day after, I made it there. And we weren't there long, but they were the 2 longest days of my life that I ever had.
We collected for 3 days, collected a total of $22,000.
We left early Tuesday morning, and like I said, got to the ground zero site at I'd say about between 5:30 and 6 a.m.
We had people literally throwing money at us. We saw many people, all ages, genders. The reactions were just what the entire United States was. A lot of emotion, yelling, screaming of happy that we were out. Very much support of what we were doing. Was because we were at a major intersection in our township, and with light changes and things, we tried to time when we had the boots out to collect, but folks wanted to give it, and we were actually catching money in midair, all denominations of money.
And then we bumped into Giuliani. In fact, he asked both Rick and I, that where'd you come from? So we told him, and he thanked us for coming, which I thought was really neat.
When Kelly had first moved in the beginning of July, the first time that I went to visit her and help her unpack, I had used MapQuest or something like that at the time, and I got bad directions from the online mapping service, and told me to get off the wrong exit of the Jersey Turnpike, and so I got kind of turned around in Jersey City, and I came up to a traffic light, and I asked some guy for the name of the street that Kel lived on at the time, and he started saying, well, you go up here and you make a left, you go 2 blocks, you make another left, and there's all these one-way streets, not unlike York, so it's a little hard to navigate. And he says, oh heck, he says, I'll jump in my car, just follow me. It's only a couple of blocks. So I follow this guy, and when we turned off the main street, Columbus Boulevard, to get into her neighborhood, I did look to my left then. This is in July. I did look to my left, and I could see the Twin Towers. And I just kind of like this thrill, of wow, Kel's actually living up here in North Jersey, just right across from Manhattan. How cool is that? So as I'm leaving her apartment, with that image and that wonderful feeling of the World Trade Center in my mind from when she first moved in, I walked over to that street, and I stood basically at the same place that I had, I turned the car into her neighborhood and took a picture of the World Trade Center's burning. I continued walking on up towards the waterfront area, and just snapped a couple of pictures along the way of what was going on. Every once in a while, every block or two, there'd be maybe somebody standing outside near their car with the doors open, the windows down, and a small group of people listening to radio reports. So I would pause along the way, chat with 1 or 2 people, try and get an update of what's going on and such. The towers had not collapsed yet, and would continue on my way. I remember when I reached the waterfront area at the first dock that I went to. I was standing there. They had evacuated all the buildings on the New Jersey side of the river as well for safety precautions, because nobody knew at that point in time was this even a terrorist attack? That was still a question, though most people were beginning to surmise that, being that there were 2 planes that had gone into 2 towers minutes apart. And there's 3 other guys standing shoulder to shoulder, just looking across the river, at everything going on. There's a little bit of light chatter. There's people walking back and forth, and everybody's just transfixed on this. And I walked up and stood next to the one guy. I'm on one end, and there's another guy on the other end. And I snapped a picture or two. And the guy on the far end looks down at his watch, and he says to the three of us, "It's September 11th." And I remember all of us kind of looking, leaning out, in front of one another, just looking at this guy. And finally one of us said, "Yeah." And he says, 911. And that was the very first connection I had with, with those numbers and what we now refer to as 9/11. The one guy brought a pair of binoculars from his office. He brought this out, and he was passing them back and forth, and we were taking looks. And the guy standing next to me hands the binoculars to me. And right as he did that, I remember looking over at the North Tower and thinking that I had seen a bird high up on the tower leave its perch and fly south towards the second tower. And he hands me the binoculars, and just as I put them up, with the binoculars, I could clearly see a person jumping from the 100th floor or something. And he wraps me in the shoulder. He says, "There, did you see that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says again, "There's another one. Did you see that?" And I said, "Yeah, it was a person jumping." He says, "That's what I thought I saw. That's why I handed you the binoculars, because I wasn't sure." And I said to him, "Well, right as you handed them to me, right before you handed them to me, I thought I saw a bird fly off the one tower to the other. It wasn't a bird, but I desperately wanted it to be a bird."
There was one actual collection point that we had where some children were shopping with their family in Delco Plaza, and they said, "We want to do something. We want to go home and get our piggy banks." And they did, and they came back with them. They quickly made up an old juice jar, which we have here in our collection from 9/11, and they put their piggy bank funds in that and gave that to us. They poured it into the collection booth that we had, and we kept the jar as a memory from that point.
It was 7 hours I didn't know what had happened to Kelly. So I kept walking back from the waterfront area back to a little shopping center where there was a payphone. I would go back there every hour and a half, and I would call my mom back here in York and just ask, "Have you heard anything from Kelly yet?" And the report from Mom kept coming back, "No." We would chat a little bit, and of course she, like the rest of America, was watching everything on the news. And then I would go back up to the waterfront again. And the one time as I was heading back up to the waterfront, I'm not quite there yet, but there's a van and a couple of guys standing outside the van, and the windows were down. They're listening to the radio. And the South Tower starts to collapse. And I snapped a picture or two, and I ran across the street up to these guys, and I said, "Did everybody get out?" And there was kind of an awkward silence, and then the one guy looking down at the ground, kind of staring at his feet, says, "I don't think so."
Friday evening was the National Candlelight Vigil, and we were not supplied to do that. We were out collecting, and some folks stopped by with a bunch of candles for the firefighters to hold. So it was almost like a surreal environment at that time. We all had lit candles. It was a little bit breezy, but the candles didn't go out, and we were all standing there in the intersection with lit candles. So it was just an experience that obviously I don't want to go through again, but it was such a positive because our community came together for us. Folks that we had no idea who they were just gave everything that they had at the time.
Why are they pulling us out of here?
Because of maintenance. The tower's leaning.
The North Tower is
Broadway.
Right, Marty, quick.
Oh my God, there it goes!
A few minutes later, what was it, a half hour or something like that, I don't remember the time frame exactly anymore, the second tower collapsed, the north tower, actually Tower 1. And I was back on the waterfront at that point. And I remember I'm watching people get off a ferry. And I took a picture of the people getting off the ferry just as the first tower began to collapse. And I have a second picture of those people kind of turned around, looking, you know, hearing the rumble and looking across the river and watching it together. One thing with watching both of the towers collapse that I still can't figure out to this day is there was a very eerie sort of sound to it. There was this very low rumble, but there was also this very high-pitched kind of a tinkling kind of sound. It was sort of ethereal, almost celestial, if you will. That at first I just thought, well, that's just the sound of acres worth of breaking glass. But I know that it was something else that I was hearing. Something metaphysical, perhaps, is the only way I can describe it. I can still hear that sound today. That'll probably be something that's with me for the rest of my life.
I remember having butterflies. I didn't know what to expect, really. And it was really, really neat going up. Once we got on the highways up close there, they had a special lane for volunteers and, you know, policemen that were coming to help out. And you got in that lane, and brother, you went, and you didn't slow down until you got there.
There was a pretty good sense of frustration, wanting to be able to do something and feeling completely helpless in that regard. And in fact, at one point, on one of the trips back to call my mom at that from that shopping center, there was a BJ's there, I believe it was, warehouse store. And I remember walking in to get change for $1, get some quarters so I could make another phone call. And there were a couple of fire trucks parked out front, and there was a few firemen talking with the store manager, and they were just grabbing pallets of bottled water to take up to the triage area. And I remember the manager telling an employee to just bring everything up from the back, you know, and they literally took every bottle of water that they had in the store there.
We collected $22,000 on 11/11 of '01. We had a planned trip to New York City to visit FDNY and deliver our funds to Ladder 5 in Greenwich Village and Rescue 5 on Staten Island. And when we arrived there, they were very hospitable to us. We had prearranged with them so that they knew we were coming. And we actually had transportation provided by the fire department there. However, it was a connection with the Red Cross. So we were provided an American Red Cross vehicle to a fire department in York County, Pennsylvania, to shuttle us around New York City in the middle of this major disaster in America. So we were treated with utmost respect and hospitality, and it was, again, just an outstanding experience for us.
At one point, I spent a fair amount of time handing out bottles of water to people getting off of the ferries. Later in the day, after the towers collapsed, there were just hundreds of people. We probably have all seen the images of people just completely gray, covered in ash and dust from head to toe. And I remember handing bottles of water to these people, and some of them would just immediately, you know, just gulp a bottle down, and others would pour it over their face and take a handkerchief or something and just try and clean some of this dirt and soot off them or whatever. And there was a certain sense of satisfaction. That might not be exactly the right word in doing this, but in some tiny little way, at least for a while, I felt as though I was contributing in some sort of way to alleviating some of the horror of that day. And something as simple as giving a person a bottle of water, you know, I remember that I can picture this one woman's face where she just kind of whispered, you know, a thank you. And that just, you know, it didn't. She didn't even say anything. I don't even know. I don't remember hearing her. I remember seeing her lips move, and the great sense of appreciation and that little connection that we made there in that instant that I just handed her a bottle and handed the next person and the next and the next. Amongst all those emotions, amongst wanting to be a journalist and record the story. Amongst the tremendous sense of worry that I had for Kelly and the greater worry that I had for the nation as a whole and what this attack was going to mean, because at that point later in the day, by the early afternoon, everybody was speculating. Of course, we didn't know for sure, but everybody was speculating at that point that this was, you know, had to be terrorist attacks. By then, of course, we had heard about the attacks on the Pentagon and the plane in Shanksville. Going down. So there was a sense of worry, frustration, helplessness. It was probably the single most emotional day I've had in my life.
It almost felt like an earthquake, like I could literally feel and see things in the office moving and the floor moving. Immediately after it was some sort of explosion or something, there was an enormous volume of debris and paper. It almost looked like a dirty parade. All of this material just falling down.
We could have been set up in a hotel, a swanky hotel. We said we turned it down for the simple reason that we were only there for 2 days, and there's other ones coming in that'll be there for longer. So we said keep that room for those people. And what we did when we were done working, we drove into Brooklyn and parked on a side street in Brooklyn and just put the seats back and tried to relax as best we could. We didn't get any sleep to amount to anything. And of course, then in the morning, went back to ground zero and did whatever they needed us to do. You know.
Our assistant chief arranged through his employer for his secretary or office worker to arrange travel arrangements for us as she does for them on a day-to-day basis. So she booked our train rail tickets through their company, and when we arrived at Amtrak, we went to give them our tickets. And as we boarded, we were in uniform, and they refused to take our tickets. And when we returned to York, we actually were provided a refund for those tickets. We paid absolutely nothing on our trip through to New York City, including the evening of Saturday, 11/11. We took a tour of New York. Some of us had never been there before, and we just took some time out, a little bit of a breather from our trip. And we actually were escorted to a special elevator at the Empire State Building, escorted by security, and they gave us our own tour of New York from the Empire State Building. We bypassed hundreds of people that were standing in line that Saturday evening. So again, we were not involved at all in the events of 9/11 other than as a support function, and we were treated with the highest respect the whole time in our experience there.
A little after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked back to a payphone and called Mom again. And Ma answered the phone. She was very excited. She picked it up real quick, first ring or something like that, as I recall, and said immediately, "I just got off the phone with Cal. She's fine. I just got off the phone." So there's this great sense of relief at that point. When both towers went down, or when the North Tower went down, all of that was the top of the building were the antennas for cell phone service. So the metropolitan area lost cell phone service early in the morning. But Kel had walked out of the South Tower about 90 seconds before the first plane had hit, and she was on her way that morning to a meeting at the Chase building next to the World Trade Center complex. And when she heard the plane hit and there's all this debris falling, well, she heard the explosion, but she couldn't see it because from her vantage point, other buildings blocked, then she couldn't see the top of the towers. She could look up and she could see this all these papers floating downward. And she thought, is this some kind of a propaganda bomb, quote unquote bomb or whatever? I mean, it's New York City after all. There's all kinds of crazy things happen there on a daily basis. And that thought lasted for just a couple of seconds, and then she began getting pelted with debris in the face and hitting her body, and people were running. And so she ran into the building next door where she was supposed to have this meeting, and the security guard's desk in the middle of the lobby there, he had a small TV on his desk, and there was a group of people beginning to gather around it. So she went over and there she watched the second plane hit on TV, even though she was just yards from where it actually happened. She left there and went and spent most of the day in the basement of her building over on Wall Street. She worked for J.P. Morgan at the time. And in fact, they were not allowing people to leave at first, just for their own security. Later in the day, after a couple of hours in there, they let everybody leave, and she walked up to a friend's apartment. She walked over to Chinatown and then up to, I believe it was 72nd or 74th Street, to a friend's apartment, and from there was able to call my mom and leave the message. She spoke with Mom briefly, and then she was trying to figure out how to get back home, how to get back onto the Jersey side. As I said, the bridges and tunnels had been closed. Very late in the day, 5, 6 o'clock, something like that, they opened up a couple of the bridges to pedestrian traffic going out only. And Kel walked from her friend's apartment to the nearest bridge, I forget which one it was, got over to the Jersey side, and then took a train. I think she actually ended up like in Hoboken, and then took a train down to Jersey City. So I'm continuing to go back and forth from the apartment, from her place in Jersey City, to the phone in the park where I first tried to call her when I audibly witnessed the second plane hitting. And I called Mom. She hadn't heard anything from Kel for a couple of hours. I called her friend whose apartment she had walked to, and she said, well, Bob, Kelly left here hours ago. I would have expected that you should have met up with her by now. I hang up, and it was almost a repeat 12 hours earlier, almost to the minute, when I hung up that same phone and the woman with the Walkman came running across the street. I hang up the phone, I turn around, and Kelly's running across the street yelling, Bob, Bob. And I ran across towards her, and the two of us met about 6 feet from where my foot touched the ground when I heard the rumble of the second plane hitting. And it was the best hug of my entire life. And we stood there and just in this embrace for what seemed like an hour, kind of collected ourselves a little bit, and then walked back to her apartment.
We hung out with some of the policemen, and we checked, vehicles, make sure that they had the proper identification to be on the site and what have you. You actually went out on the rubble path and filled the buckets up with whatever you could fill up, and then you passed them down to the end of the line, and then the guy at the end really went through it to see if there was anything there
We are a brotherhood, whether it's in the time of tragedy or disaster. We are in a form of brotherhood. When we experience a tragedy, no matter whether we know the person or not, it's one of us. It's one of our family. We've participated in fire department funerals around the country and around the region where we have no idea who the person was, but we know of the events and we just come together to do that.
How have I changed in the last 10 years? Hopefully I've grown a bit, as we all do with time. How has this event changed me? How has the event of September 11, 2001 changed me? I learned in a way that that I never had before the events of that morning, to appreciate every day. I know that may sound kind of trite, but it's one thing to know that you know, any one of us could step off a curb and get hit by the proverbial bus. Having witnessed this mass destruction that occurred that day and how it has changed America as a whole and threw us into two wars that have occupied most of those 10 years, and you think about how this has impacted the families of the people who lost friends and loved ones that day, and then the families and loved ones of the service personnel who have sacrificed to spend how many tours in Afghanistan or in Iraq, being away from their family, and of course the thousands of service personnel that have not returned at all or have come back wounded psychologically or physically or both. In a lot of ways, it's made me a much more serious person. And it has, I've always been highly politically active, but the events of September 11th, 2001 made me take things to a whole, my activism to a whole new level. Indirectly led to me becoming the chairperson of the Democratic Party of York County. In some ways, it's taken my life in a whole new direction than where I was headed perhaps at the time.
It made me appreciate what I have. You know, it isn't much. I don't have much, but you know, when something like that happens, it tends to make you appreciate what you have. You know, not to take things for granted. Sure, I was sad over what happened, but you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do what you have to do. You know, do I look at myself as a hero? Hell no. I'm far from a hero. I was a volunteer.
I think so often of what happened 10 years ago. 2 weeks ago, I visited Flight 93, which is an area where my family is from. Flight 93 flew over my grandparents' house just prior to crashing. It was actually in the inversion mistake when it went over my grandparents' home. So it kind of had a personal attachment to me. And I very seldom, a day goes by, you know, we walk in the fire station, there's a reminder, we have United States flags in just about every room. We fly the United States flag on our apparatus since 9/11. And it's just something obviously no one will ever forget. And I often flash back to that exact day when I walked in the firehouse and got that phone call from our chief.
I hope and pray my children and grandchildren don't ever have to go through anything like this.
As I was walking back on one of my trips from calling my mom from the shopping center back to the waterfront area, I'm walking down the sidewalk and there's this cluster of 4 people. There was a woman in her 70s, the matriarch of the family clearly, and 3 younger people in late 20s, maybe 30, kind of gathered in a semicircle around her. And the mother has a telephone pressed up tight to her ear. And there's this look of worry on all of their faces. Just as I'm passing them, I hear the mother say, "She missed her train! She missed her train!" And the group closed in this big hug, and just everybody began sobbing.